Why should they tune in and listen to this episode?
Aging is bad for you, and it seems like something that we ought to be able to do something about with medicine, at least in the future. So the question is, how foreseeable is that future? There are many, many signs indicating that we may be within striking distance of bringing aging under really comprehensive medical control.
Aubrey de Grey is the godfather of the longevity movement, pioneering the fight against aging for over 2 decades. His bold vision and scientific advocacy has reshaped how the world thinks about death, decay, and the possibility of indefinite life.
A huge proportion of what dominates the global economy consists of industries that are built upon how long people think they're going to live. Health insurance, life insurance, pensions, inheritance arrangements. If that is turned upside down overnight, it's going to be complete mayhem. Nobody's going to know what to do.
Do you fear that we might end up just going too fast and then we're just back to 2020, 2015? The future looks amazing, but also a little scary. If you, just like me, want to have an honest outlook of what the next chapter could look like and how best to prepare for that, I ask for one simple favour: subscribe, so I can invite the brightest minds on this podcast and get those answers for both you and I. Enjoy the episode. For someone who knows nothing about the longevity space, very curious about it, or for someone who is deeply ingrained in the space, why should they tune in and listen to this episode?
Of course, the first question is, why would someone be curious about this topic in the first place? And I hope that the main reason why someone who doesn't yet know much about it would be curious is that they intuitively understand the basis for why anybody works on longevity. Namely, that aging is miserable, aging is bad for you, and it seems like something that we ought to be able to do something about with medicine, at least in the future. So the question is, how foreseeable is that future? And of course, there's a lot of buzz about that topic at the moment. And of course, the reason why there's a buzz, and the buzz is not just, a very brief temporary thing, but seems to be persisting and indeed intensifying, is because there's a lot of progress. There are many, many signs indicating that we may be within striking distance of bringing aging under really comprehensive medical control and letting people stay healthy, truly healthy and youthful, however long ago they were born.
You have been predicting longevity escape velocity, which is physical, biological immortality, now with an expected date of the early 2030s. How sure are you of that happening?
Well, first of all, not the early 2030s, the late 2030s, but still the 2030s. Of course, I'm not sure. This is pioneering technology, so any timeframe predictions have to be probabilistic. But yes, I do think that we have a 50-50 chance of getting to this thing I've called longevity escape velocity, which has a technical definition, but we don't need to get into that. Essentially, it's what you said. By about that time. And I've been giving these timeframe predictions for about 20 years. Now, it must be said that when I started predicting this, I was saying the late 2020s or at least, around 2030. But the good news is that almost all anyway, of the slippage in those timeframes occurred during the first 10 years, between, let's say, 2005 and 2015. By 2015, I was already saying late 2030s, and I still am. So you may ask, what's changed between those 2 decades? And the fundamental answer is progress has sped up, and a large part of why it's sped up is because there's been more enthusiasm from the wider world and more money. Now, I do want to emphasize that even today, the increased funding for this field is very unevenly distributed. there is inevitably a lot of money going into the areas that are perceived as the lower hanging fruit, the areas where, money might be made fairly soon. So of course these are people who are coming in as investors more than donors. Secondly, it's just that some of this is just not patentable, not monetizable in a simple way, though in due course it certainly will be. But also, even in academia, people are very much biased towards working on the low-hanging fruit so as to get more publications and get promoted and, get their next grant application funded and everything. So I have tended to try to compensate for that by working on the most challenging things and, trying to just persuade people to give me the money to do stuff that otherwise will not be done, but which is absolutely vital for this field.
One of your most recent studies has been on, I think it was 1,000 mice, or maybe you were looking at doing it 2,000, and you were testing 4 different areas that showed a lot of promise. Mm-hmm. One of them was rapamycin, which has had some efficacy in previous results. And then there were 3 more as well. There was the young hematopoietic stem cells, I'm butchering that word, and then some gene therapy, and then some navitoclax as well. Could you explain a bit about how those results are going? And also, what are the key areas of promise that you're seeing in 2025 in the aging space?
Yeah, sure. So this experiment was indeed 1,000 mice. It began in early 2023, and it concluded about 6 months ago. And we gave mice, as you say, these 4 things. We had 10 different treatment groups, getting different subsets of those 4 things. Rapamycin, as you say, is a kind of the gold standard for life extension in mice these days. Many people have done it in different ways with different, protocols, and it works. And we kind of know why. But for us, it's actually a kind of what a scientist would call a positive control. In other words, we don't think that it's actually going to give much benefit in long-lived species like humans. But we still wanted to make sure that we were just doing the experiment well and accurately. So we included it for that reason. The other 3 interventions.
Sorry, can I just go on to that with rapamycin? Is that definitive now?
What, that it works in mice? Absolutely. And that it won't work very well in humans? Also, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. I mean, essentially, to go into the details of that a little bit, rapamycin is what's called a calorie restriction mimetic. It essentially tricks the body into thinking that it's not getting enough food when in fact it is getting enough food. And calorie restriction mimetics, indeed calorie restriction itself, when one is genuinely not getting enough food, have been shown for literally a century now to extend life. But it extends life a lot more in short-lived species than in long-lived species. And we kind of understand why that is. It's all to do with the frequency of famines of different lengths in the actual wild. But anyway, the point is, it's not going to be the Holy Grail for aging. Okay. The Holy Grail for aging is going to be a divide and conquer, multi-pronged attack on damage that the body accumulates. Essentially preventative maintenance, removing different types of damage that the body does to itself throughout life. And so the other 3 interventions that we used in this study were of that nature. One of them was, as you say, basically young bone marrow transplant. We killed a lot of young mice and scraped out their bone marrow and purified out the stem cells, and then we injected those stem cells into older mice in such a way that some of those stem cells would survive long term. And then the second treatment was gene therapy for, as you say, it was for one gene called telomerase, which a lot of people know about. It's a gene that's involved in allowing cells to continue dividing when they normally wouldn't. And then the third thing was this drug, which is a type of senolytic. So a senolytic is a drug that removes a particular type of cell, often called zombie cells colloquially. Technically, they're called senescent cells. And they're bad for you. They accumulate gradually throughout life, and the more we can get rid of them, the better. So these drugs are very popular right now. Some of them are even in clinical trials already. All right, so we did those three things. And yes, well, basically our goal was to demonstrate that we could get additivity, so that you do more of these things, you get more of a life extension than you do if you only do one of them. And we did get that. The result was a little bit confusing in male mice, but in females it was completely clear. So that's pretty good, but not good enough, because the actual magnitude of life extension we got was really only about the same as you can get just with rapamycin on its own, or with calorie restriction on its own. So we want to see whether we can beat that, and we believe that the right way to beat it is to use more different things, more types of damage repair, so as to to tick more of the boxes, if you like. So the next experiment we want to do will indeed be 2,000 mice, and it will be 8 interventions. But it means it's going to cost even more. The first study cost $3.5 million. The next ones, we're going to do it in less than 7 because we've identified a few cost savings, but it's still going to be 5 or 6 million. And so I'm spending all my time now desperately trying to persuade people to help support that, because I can't start the experiment until we know we can finish it. And indeed, most of the expense is right at the beginning.
In 2025, you've got everything from whole body replacement. You've got some very, very sci-fi-esque sort of ideas and work going on in clinics. So if you were to, what is the 8 going to be? What's the combination likely going to be?
Whole body replacement is definitely not ready for prime time. This is the idea of essentially growing a whole new body that doesn't have a brain, which we kind of know how to do, and attaching it to the head of an old animal. This is, a serious area of study right now, no question, but it's not ready for prime time. The things that we're going to do will be of the same nature that I just described. Either they will be things supplied in the diet, but mostly they will be supplied by injection. So they'll be typically, cell therapies and gene therapies, you inject them into the bloodstream typically. And we're definitely ready to do that. So just as soon as we get the money, we have all the collaborators lined up, all the sourcing of the reagents, the places where we're going to do the experiment, all of that. We're pretty happy about the design of the experiment, but as you say, there are lots of much more radical. Well, there are some much more radical approaches, which are often being pursued simply by people who are less optimistic than me about the potential, about the time frame for doing life extension, what we might call the easy way, which is by doing this multi-pronged approach.
You said there's going to be a cascade moment when one of these mice trials really shows promise, and that a lot more public funding will come in, and that will then kind of accelerate this hockey stick curve that we're seeing. Do you have any predictions on when that would happen?
Well, it could be quite soon. I mean, I think so there's a particular milestone that I've chosen to highlight, which I call robust mouse rejuvenation. And it's defined in terms of the kinds of experiments that we're doing. So one thing I have to emphasize about the experiment we just did and the ones that we want to do going forward is we don't start when the mice are young. We start when they're already in middle age. So typical mice will live about 2.5 years on average. We start the experiments when they're already 1.5 years old. So they've got an average of a year to live. And when you do that with anything that we can do today, like rapamycin that I just mentioned, the amount of life extension that you can get typically is about 4 months. So I have defined robust mouse rejuvenation as same kind of experiment, start at 18 months in mice that would normally live to 2.5 years, but you get 12 months of life extension. So they live on average to 3.5 years. So that means 3 times the effect size of what we can do today. And the question is, how soon will we be likely to get to there? I think, honestly, my current assessment is that we've got an 80% chance of getting to that point within the next 3 of these combination experiments. We might get there with the next one. I don't know. But yeah, so I'm saying within the next 3 or 4 years, we've got a very good chance of getting to that moment. And yes, you're quite right. I believe that will change everything in terms of the conversation around what to do about aging. My new slogan is I want to make aging the new COVID. In other words, I want the world to actually, pull its finger out and start doing something about aging and having the determination to do something about aging, in the same way that it did 5 years ago.
Mm.
And the point is, we don't have to assume that the same things that work in mice, that get us to robust mouse rejuvenation, are also going to work in humans. There's a pretty good chance that the panel of interventions that we end up using in humans that actually works and gets us to longevity escape velocity will be substantially different than what works in mice. But that doesn't really matter, because what matters is to have shown that something works in mice. Even if it's something else that works in humans in due course, at least we'll know that this is really possible, and we'll be able to, exhibit some determination and break out of our current, fatalism and, terror of getting our hopes up that holds everything back at the moment.
Because I coined you as the godfather of longevity. I don't know if other people have called you that before, but
I've been called one or two things, yeah.
You've seen the space evolve from, I'm sure, being in a small room with a dozen scientists to now being, in many ways, rock stars. How did you predict this moment? And let's move past the mice studies into human trials and all that. What is that going to start looking like as well? So 2 questions there.
Yeah, sure. So the first question, as you say, I started off just, talking to nobody except scientists. In the the late 1990s, when I was starting to get going, I did start getting involved online in various discussion groups, including, more amateur scientists and enthusiasts, just in order to, raise the quality of debate, just to make sure that things were being accurately discussed. And that's how I got somewhat known within that community, but really within a very small community. And then around 2002, 2003, I started getting invited to speak at slightly more general audience conferences. And people started noticing. I started getting, big, like 10-page profiles in high-profile magazines. I think the first one was Fortune magazine. And a year or two after that, I got to speak at TED. So, it all happened really rather quickly when it started. And, well, I'd always known that that I had a reasonable amount of charisma. But on the other hand, I'd never had a teaching post even at university. So I had no experience of public speaking. And so I was very much learning on the job. But yeah, I mean, by the time I spoke at TED, it had become pretty clear that, I had what it took to inspire people. And I recognized very much, even back then, that getting to my goal of saving a lot of lives, getting aging defeated as soon as possible, was going to require not only breakthroughs in the science, but also breakthroughs in society to get people to take the job seriously. And to be honest, by that time, I had done most of the necessary science. I'd put the ideas out there, and really what was required was simply to get people to put enough money in to implement the ideas that I had published. And of course that happened. I started my first foundation together with a businessman named Dave Goebel in 2003. That was the Methuselah Foundation. And we started funding research in, I'm going to say 2005, in a very small way, just a couple of PhD students. But that grew progressively over time. So, of course, I've been spending my time, as the chief science officer of a succession of organizations, therefore overseeing actual implementation of these ideas. But I definitely, for the past 15 years at least, I've been spending the majority of my time on the advocacy and outreach and, inspirational side of things. So then your second question about clinical trials and so on. Well, so this is already happening. It's very important to understand that because this is a divide and conquer approach, a multi-pronged approach, some of the prongs are a lot easier to implement than others, and the easiest ones are already in the clinic. So, certain stem cell therapies, for example, one thing that I always highlight, very important one, is stem cell therapies for Parkinson's disease. Mm. This is something which was by no means my idea. This was already very much a twinkle in people's eye in the 1980s, certainly the 1990s. people started trying it, and they occasionally got it to work. And when it did work, it worked spectacularly well. But they couldn't get it to work reproducibly back then because we didn't know enough about how to manipulate stem cells. We do know that now. So there's half a dozen clinical trials going on right now to use stem cells to treat Parkinson's disease, and everyone's very optimistic. Yeah. Then senolytics. So we mentioned navitoclax, this drug that we used in our mouse experiment. There are other senolytics, and some of those are in clinical trials right now. And this will continue. As time goes on, we'll get more and more of these things moving into the clinic. I believe, within the next 5 years, most of the things that we're going to need will be in the clinic. But typically they will be in it in clinical trials individually, rather than being put together. And that's where the offshore situation comes in. So there are quite a lot of people right now who are interested in sidestepping and short-circuiting the regulatory bureaucracy and inertia that exists in pretty much all established jurisdictions, and in just getting on and trying things out that seem to have good evidence for safety and efficacy. And so, that's basically medical tourism. And that's been a big deal in terms of stem cell therapies for quite a while now. There are places in like Panama and Costa Rica and so on, which offer the kinds of things that you can't legally offer in the US. But it's going further than that now. In particular, gene therapies are becoming a big deal because we're getting better at gene therapy, both in terms of delivering new genes that the body doesn't have or that the body is not activating, and also in terms of what's called gene editing, which is the technology really spearheaded by this thing called CRISPR, which many people will have heard of. Anyway, all of that kind of thing is, very popular now, but a lot of enthusiasm for it. And so there are places around the world that are coming into existence offering this kind of thing. One particularly important one is a special economic zone in Honduras called Prospera. It's actually not on the mainland of Honduras. It's on an island off the coast called Roatan. And, it's only a couple of square miles or so, but they have clinics and companies that are incorporating there because it's, as I say, it's a special economic zone. And they're very much, aiming to become a global hub of medical tourism. However, I will say that that's not good enough. Essentially because medical tourism, pretty much by definition, is only available to a small number of people who have enough money to get there and to pay for things that are not paid by insurance and so on. So we absolutely need established jurisdictions to get on and do this too. And, we could say, well, okay, eventually this is going to happen because of FOMO. The established jurisdictions are just going to see that these other places are succeeding and they're going to try and follow suit. But that will take a long time. So I'm in much more of a hurry than that. And that's why I go back to my concept of making aging the new COVID. The thing is, if you'd asked anybody in 2019 whether there was any scenario that they could conceive of in which a vaccine for something or other would be developed and globally distributed in less than 1 year, they would have totally laughed at you. Because before then, the record was like 10 years, right? But it happened, and the only thing that it needed was the public to want it. The public were just not in favor of COVID. And so everything we thought we knew about, institutional inertia and regulatory bureaucracy and so on was just swept away. It just as if it had never existed. We need that kind of attitude with regard to aging, and I believe that we can get there.
It's the immediacy. I always think about COVID, like why it was just such an immediate desire to get ourselves out of that mess. But it feels like with aging, for the vast majority of us, it's just something in the distant future, and we don't have.
Well, that's right. That's right. It's psychological. It's psychological management, really. The fact is, aging has been something that we've been totally aware of since the dawn of civilization. And we've known that we couldn't do anything about it. And we have just found ways to put it out of our minds, either by pretending that it's not a disease, that it's somehow woven into the fabric of the universe and is essentially off limits to medicine, even in principle, or alternatively, pretending that it's some kind of blessing in disguise and that we shouldn't be messing with it. Both of which are complete nonsense. But the point is, it doesn't matter how irrational your rationalizations are for this, just as long as they work and they succeed in letting you get on with your miserably short life and not be preoccupied by this terrible thing that's going to happen to you. So that's the thing we have to break. That's what I call the pro-aging trance that we have to break out of. And the question is how? Now, of course, I've been, as I say, as you said, I've been up on stage and on camera a lot over the past 20 odd years. And it hasn't really worked very well. I mean, I've made some progress. I'm very proud of the extent to which I've helped build this community. But, it's still pitifully small. It's almost never that you have a conference in this space that attracts more than 1,000 people.
Yeah.
It's pathetic. So what can we do? My answer is there's one thing we can do. The final step of the chain of events is easy. Governments will do what the public demands because governments like to get re-elected. That's the easy part. The question is how to get the public to demand this. And logic doesn't seem to work. So the answer is influencers. I've been saying this for quite a long time. It dawned on me, 20 odd years ago that there was this crazy phenomenon where if Oprah Winfrey says, buy this book, everybody, well, not everybody, but an awful lot of people just go out and do it. Like that day. I mean, what? But that's what happens. And of course, now it's not just Oprah. You've got Joe Rogan and you've got, Lex Friedman and Mr. Beast and a number of other global influencers. So what I want to do is target those people. I want those people to be demanding an actual war on aging, a COVID-scale war on aging, which they're not doing yet. But what they are doing is expressing an interest in the topic generally. I've been on Rogan a couple of times. I've been on, David Sinclair's been on Rogan. And, it happens quite a bit. So they don't mind people knowing that they're interested in the topic. But being interested in one thing, demanding action is another thing. But they are in a position where they could if they wanted to. So I want to make them want to. And my approach to doing that is essentially to make progress in the laboratory, to do this robust mass rejuvenation thing so that most of my colleagues, my expert colleagues in the community, will themselves say, you know what, we can start talking about timeframes. I've been talking about timeframes, as you mentioned, for 20 odd years. My colleagues have vigorously refused to do so. And essentially, they witter on about, not wanting to overpromise and underdeliver, which is nonsense. What they really want is not to be in a position where anyone else can characterize them as saying things that are irresponsible, because that will endanger their next grant application. Almost all of my colleagues in the field, my expert colleagues, certainly the ones that do a lot of media, are academics. They're people who get most of their money from government grants, which are peer reviewed, and so it's a lot harder for them than it is for me. And that's but I think that will completely change when we get these mics, because that will be such a dramatic breakthrough that people will feel they have permission to say much more aggressive things.
Quickly, a cheap question, but given we were talking about influencers, what's your opinion on Bryan Johnson?
So Bryan, I'm very clear about Bryan. I think he is definitely a net positive. He is controversial, certainly, in a number of ways, largely because he's very shameless about how he has chosen to live his life. And a lot of people would not want to live their lives that way. And so he kind of turns them off. But against that, his shamelessness is a positive as well. Basically not being scared to be laughed at or to be ridiculed. That's very important in life. I was there once. So I really admire that. And the fact is, he appeals to a different audience than I do. There are people who he gets excited, and maybe they get excited in not quite the best way at first, but that's definitely a big stepping stone to getting excited in what is the best way, as the next step. So yeah, I think Bryan is doing important and valuable work.
It's something I asked, I think it was Carl Flager at Vitalis Bay. He was talking a lot about the funding issue in longevity biotech, the space that longevity biotechs inhabit and are raising money in. And I asked him the question, why don't we piggyback on the success of the wellness of the digital health movement? For example, Superpower, I've had Max Marchione, the founder, on the podcast, raised at a $300 million valuation on what was basically a wait list. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's a way to go about things, piggybacking on the success of the wellness movement?
We've kind of been trying to do that. I mean, the difficulty is that what we need to do is preventative medicine. I, have always found it a bit paradoxical that on the one hand, people will totally be happy with signing up to the mantra that prevention is better than cure. But when it comes to preventative medicine, they take the opposite view. Essentially, when it's not medicine, when it's lifestyle and diet and other things that come under the wellness category, then we're talking about things where people don't feel that there's any significant safety risk. Whereas when the word medicine comes into the equation, people think, this looks like it might be experimental, it might make me sick rather than delay the point at which I get sick. And the thing is, of course, almost everybody in the world is pathetically bad at reasoning about uncertainties and probabilities. So the fact that the risk of the thing making you sick when you're not yet sick is minuscule, and the opportunity of delaying how soon you get sick is quite substantial, that just doesn't feature. The fact that the risk cannot be argued to be exactly zero is enough. It's like, in clinical trials, one person dies in a clinical trial and, all hell breaks loose and, whole swathes of research are shut down for like a year or more. Millions of people die because of the slow approval of a drug or of a type of drug, and it doesn't make headlines at all. It's insane, but that's what it's all about. So piggybacking off the wellness movement is a great idea in principle, but it's a lot easier said than done. I will also say, though, since you mentioned that big fundraise, that was in the private sector, of course. People are much more willing, people with serious bank balances are much more willing to invest than to donate. In my previous foundation, where we were focusing on developing things that did have intellectual property, and we were patenting things, that was a fine business model, and that's what we did. Half a dozen times we spun out our projects once we got them to a certain point as startup companies. And they started going faster because they were able to raise more money because the money was invested rather than donated. But some of the things that we have to do just are not amenable to that. They're just not patentable, or the patents are owned by other people or whatever. And those things are just as vital. So these combination experiments are a classic example of that. So we just need people to do what the donors that have supported my work over these past 20 years have done. Peter Thiel is very much an investor first and a donor second. He doesn't like giving money away, but in 2006 he became my first major donor, and the reason he did was because he saw that by promoting this stuff philanthropically, he could create an industry. He could actually get research to the point where it was investable, and that's of course exactly what happened. So we just need more people to think that way.
You were talking a bit before about stem cells and gene therapy, and I recently had Matthias Bernau from Cellco, who do mesenchymal stem cells, and then we had Yuta Lee, who's doing human trophoblast stem cells on the podcast, and then we have a gene therapy special coming up with some amazing guests as well. As you mentioned, the issue with this space is all it takes is for one death to put the space back 20 years, or however long, as what happened with gene therapy in the past, and as can possibly happen with stem cell injuries as well if you don't have a GMP facility. Do you fear that we might end up just going too fast and then we're just back to 2020, 2015?
No, I do not. I think that at this point we have a couple of reasons to be confident that just can't happen. One reason is that the range of technologies that are being pursued is just so diverse. So, one trial going badly or one company getting a bad reputation is just not going to sink the field at all, really. There's just too many other places to be. And the momentum, the buzz in the private sector, let alone in the wider world, is just, too loud now to be vulnerable, I believe, to that kind of thing.
Aubrey, let's get philosophical.
Really?
Have you ever feared death?
I don't think about death very much. No. I don't even think of other people's death very much. I like to point out that I don't really work on longevity. I work on health. Longevity is a side effect of health. If you stay healthy, then chances are you won't die tomorrow, right? Of course, I mean really healthy. I don't mean just not having any of the things that we call diseases. I mean also not having the things that we call aging itself. One thing that I always point out at the beginning of my talks is that there is no meaningful difference between the diseases of old age and aging itself. That it's just semantic. That there are certain aspects of aging that we have chosen to give disease-like names to, and certain ones that we haven't, and that is all. And once one recognizes that, then one defines health in a different way. It should be defined not as don't have this list of conditions, but rather you can keep up with your granddaughter on the dance floor. That's right. That's how it should be defined. And people who can keep up with their granddaughter on the dance floor don't tend to die tomorrow. So longevity is a side effect of proper health. And so I work on health.
How does superintelligence play a part in this? Peter Diamandis, Bryan Johnson, these guys just talk about AI first, really. Do you see AI as the unlock when it comes to longevity escape velocity?
I talked about Bryan as a net positive, and I'm not taking that back. But one thing I didn't mention that I do find is damaging in Bryan's message is he believes too much in AI. And and the reason it's damaging is because he's not the only one, and he gets other people to believe it too. AI as it is today, which nobody would call artificial superintelligence, is already playing a big, big part in medical progress, not just in aging by any means. The most conspicuous example, of course, is AlphaFold, this amazing program coming out of DeepMind that is able to predict the three-dimensional shape of proteins just by looking at their amino acid sequence. There's still progress to be made there, but it's improving all the time. And so that's amazing. And AI is being used in drug discovery across the board. So that's all fantastic. But the problem is that Bryan and others have been saying and thinking that once AI gets a lot better, that it's just going to figure it out. It's just going to, tell us how to live forever, and that's that. And the thing is, that's not how AI works. AI does not invent knowledge out of thin air. It gets insights out of data, right? It needs the data to start from. So we have to do these actual real-world experiments in actual labs with actual mice in order for AI to have a chance of telling us what to do next. And we could just wait or put all our money into developing artificial superintelligence as quickly as possible and then say, all right, what should we do? And it'll tell us, and we do it, and we give it the results, and it says, okay, do this next. But we could get a head start, just by doing some experiments now that we think are probably valuable and informative, so that the AI, gets a head start. And I'm having to work quite hard to drill that into the minds of people who are kind of AI believers.
Away from your combination then, and away from superintelligence, is there any work in particular that you're looking at thinking this is going to move the needle forward?
Oh, all the time. I mean, of course, these combination experiments can only happen because of other people's work on each of the components individually. 3 years ago, when we were designing the first experiment, the reason I hadn't tried to do such things 5 years earlier was because there just weren't anything. There wasn't anything that was working significantly on its own individually, except for rapamycin, which doesn't really count, as I said. It was only because of things like stem cells and telomerase gene therapy coming out of the woodwork that this became possible. But it's accelerating. Over the past 3 years, while experiment number one was in progress, there's been at least half a dozen more reports of things working. And here I'm only talking about things that do count as damage repair, as removal of some type of damage, rather than calorie restriction mimetics that slow down the accumulation of damage. So now, not only can I ramp it up and do an 8 intervention experiment next, I can actually do 2 of them in parallel, and I'd still probably have a few, things in reserve. So, that's really good news. And of course, each individual component of that good news, every day, well, not every day, but at least every month, there's some new study that comes out that I'm paying close attention to and try to determine, the relevance of it. Sometimes it's not completely relevant because, for example, they started the treatment too young or too old sometimes, or they didn't use normal mice. They used mice that are artificially short-lived. These kinds of reasons. But still, of course, as a scientist, I look at the thing and I ask, what do I infer of what might happen in another context?
Aubrey, I'm going to give you a crystal ball. I want to look into your crystal ball, actually, I should say. By 2030, what will the world look like to you?
2030, we're not going to get to a longevity escape velocity, but we have a very good chance, I would say, of getting to RMR, robust mass rejuvenation. I'll be doing a lot of, shall we say, softening up of the key players in what needs to happen when we do get to robust mass rejuvenation. That means my fellow experts, especially the ones who do a lot of media, a lot of interfacing with the wider world, of whom there are not very many, I should point out. I mean, literally, you can count them on the fingers of 2 hands, because I want them to be ready. I want them to have kind of prepared their own minds, psyched themselves up to be in a position to go out and say the kind of things I feel they need to say, as and when I give them the data with which to say it. And then, of course, softening up the influencers, getting them to be ready to actually demand a COVID-scale war on aging as and when the experts give them, if you like, the permission to do so. But yeah, so 2030, I think that's, if not a year or 2 earlier, we've got a good chance of getting to that point, and then that's when all hell will break loose. Everyone, they witter on about, in a post-aging world, where are we going to put all the people? Won't dictators live forever? And, how will we pay the pensions? These are easy questions to answer. And I've been answering them for 20 years, and it's distinctly frustrating that nobody listens to the answers. But there you go. But what's much more difficult is what happens pretty much overnight when the influencers start doing their influencing. What's going to happen is that most of the world, literally over a period of like a week, are going to transition from an expectation that they will live only slightly longer than their parents did to an expectation that they will live essentially indefinitely. Now, think what that means for the economy, the global economy. What dominates the global economy? A huge proportion of what dominates the global economy consists of industries that are built upon how long people think they're going to live. Health insurance, life insurance, pensions, inheritance arrangements. So if that is turned upside down overnight, it's going to be complete fucking mayhem. Nobody's going to know what to do. Therefore, one thing that I also am working and have been working for some time very hard to educate people on, the relevant people, is to anticipate that. When I give talks to, pension funds and banks and so on, the title of my talk is typically Anticipate the Anticipation. In other words, be ready, do your preparation now so that when people acquire, as I say, overnight, the anticipation that they're going to live a very long time, with high probability, then you can roll out your new product line. Just like that. You can be ready to minimize the turbulence that is associated with this profound sea change in the way that people think about their future.
And that week is going to happen in the late 2030s. That's what you
With
predict.
high probability, I would say. No, sorry, that week's going to happen in the late 2020s.
Late
That's the point.
2020s, the
That's
start
right.
scale.
I think we have a pretty good chance of reaching longevity escape velocity itself by the late 2030s. I think the war on aging, the COVID scale war on aging, I would estimate is probably going to take about a decade from when it begins, but it's going to begin around 2030, if not a little earlier.
For someone sweating right now, they might be in their 60s thinking, I want to be 100 dancing with at my great granddaughter's wedding. What would you advise for them to do? Are there any protocols that you would recommend for them?
Honestly, first of all, you have to remember I'm a PhD, not an MD. So I don't recommend things that we can already do. I work on things that we can't already do. The one thing I will say, though, is everybody is different. So do not believe what you read in a book, because by definition, books are written to appeal to the lowest common denominator. Everyone's different. The only generic advice that one can give is pay attention to your own body, do what works for you. And another thing I want to mention that's extremely positive about Bryan Johnson, measure as much as you can. Bryan is very, very, very strong on measurement, and he's totally right. The more you know about what your body's doing and where the weak links might be in your metabolism, the better the chance you have of doing something about it. I have one weak link in my metabolism. It's not very weak, but I have rather high levels of a chemical in my blood called homocysteine, which is supposed to be bad for you. Doesn't seem to be particularly bad for me, but I prefer not to have it anyway. And fairly recently, my genome was sequenced, and it was established why I have high homocysteine. I have a particular variant of one particular gene, and it turns out that there's a vitamin you can take that basically fixes that, a variant of vitamin B12. So I take that now. I've never taken a supplement before, but I take that one now. These are the things that you can't know unless you have the data.
Are there any genome sequencing companies you'd recommend, or testing companies?
I mean, it honestly doesn't matter. You can sequence your genome for $1,000 now, even perhaps a little less. And everybody who sequences genomes knows how to do it. It's not a particularly rare skill set anymore. So, I don't think there's any point in recommending one company over another.
A last question. What was your parting piece of advice for people within the longevity space of how to move forward in the best possible way as we reach this climactic event that we expect to happen in 2029 or the late 2020s?
Well, I mean, of course, the longevity space consists of a wide variety of people with a wide variety of different skill sets. When people come to me and they say, I want to get involved in the longevity movement, I want to make a difference, what do you advise? My first answer is, of course, not an answer at all, but a list of half a dozen questions to understand what their skill sets are, what their constraints are, and so on. Because at the end of the day, what you've got to do is, number one, what you're good at. Number two, what not very many other people are good at. You've got to, make a difference that way. And so it varies for different people. But those are if you follow those two rules, think about what you're good at, that you might be able to do, and then find out which things you're good at are in shortest supply in the community as it currently exists, then you're on the right track.
Brilliant. Aubrey, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, likewise. Thank you for having me.
If you want to know what tomorrow has in store like I do, you definitely want to listen to our recent episode where I talked to Peter Diamandis about a future where we could live forever. Thank you so much.